The term Dark Ages, originally used to describe the perceived cultural, economic and social decline in post-Roman Europe, carries an additional meaning in this context. A darkness born not out of collapse but of obscurity. In many regions, including northern Britain, the historical record becomes increasingly difficult to trace. Caledonia is a prime example. During the period of Roman occupation in Britannia, the northern territories remained largely beyond Rome's effective control. While Roman forces did make expeditions into the highlands, their long-term presence was confined to the area between two defensive frontiers, Hadrian's Wall and the lesser-known Antonine Wall to the north. Beyond these fortified lines lay tribes and communities the Romans collectively labelled as barbarians, peoples outside the empire's reach and cultural framework. As Roman authority in Britannia receded, the historical picture grew even more fragmented. It is into this shadowed landscape of Caledonia that the Picts first emerge in the written record, mentioned in late Roman sources as a distinct and, at times, troublesome presence. This elusive group gradually rose in power, eventually dominating the far northern and eastern reaches of the island, extending their influence across much of what would later be known as Caledonia. Their legacy endures not only in written accounts and archaeological traces, but in the very landscape where they once held sway. It is to these places that we now turn as we journey through some of Scotland's most fascinating Pictish sites, exploring who these people really were, what life might have been like for the ordinary person living in Pictland, and learn more about the hidden world they left behind, from a modest collection of material artefacts and a series of enigmatic monumental stones that are scattered across the Scottish landscape, whose full meanings continue to evade interpretation. Although little remains of this once powerful people, by examining the few surviving sources, from the latest archaeological discoveries to the material culture the Picts left behind, we can begin to shed light on what they never tell you about the Picts and attempt to answer one of Scotland's most enduring historical mysteries. Who were the Picts? Bede's account of Pictish origins is echoed in the Pictish Chronicle, which was a legendary record of Pictish kings compiled in the late 10th century, some 2.5 centuries after Bede was writing. This so-called Scythian foundation myth, while intriguing, has long been regarded by historians as a literary construct rather than a reliable historical account. It's also worth noting that Scythia, a Roman geographical term, may have referred not to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, as often assumed, but rather to the southern part of Scandinavia. If so, this might be what Bede had in mind when mentioning the Picts' supposed origin. Regardless, beyond the obvious mythical elements of the Scythian story, recent genetic research has cast further doubt on the idea of an exotic migration. A 2013 study extracted genomes from individuals buried in Pictish-era cemeteries in Fife and Easter Ross. These were then compared with genomes from other Iron Age Britons and modern Scots, particularly those in areas once part of Pictish political domains. The results were clear. Using allele frequency and haplotype-based approaches, the researchers were able to firmly place the genomes within the Iron Age gene pool in Britain and demonstrate regional biological affinity. In other words, the Picts were genetically native to Iron Age Britain, undermining any lingering claims of a foreign origin myth from Scythia or elsewhere. While the Pictish Chronicle repeats Bede's tale, it also adds its own flourishes. It introduces the legend of the 7 children of Cruithne. Cruithne was the mythical founder of Pictland. He is said to have ruled for 100 years, with each of his 7 sons reigning after him. The names of these sons corresponding to the 7 provinces of Pictland: Fib, Fidach, Fortriu, Cat, Se, Fotla, and Serson. This tidy correspondence between the sons and the regions is naturally suspicious. It likely served a political purpose, possibly to legitimise the expansionist efforts of the Kingdom of Fortriu, which was the most powerful Pictish kingdom. Naming territories after eponymous founders was a common theme in early medieval literature. Taken together, this suggests that the Picts were not foreign invaders, but rather the indigenous population of the area that rose to prominence in post-Roman Scotland. The term Pict itself only enters the written record in the early medieval period. Earlier Roman authors, such as Tacitus and Ptolemy, describe these northern regions as being home to a variety of Brittonic tribes. Ptolemy, for instance, names the Caledonii, Vacomagi, Decanti, the Texali, the Verturiones, and the Venicones. Tacitus gives an account of the Roman victory over the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius in 83 AD, where a Roman force under the command of Agricola won a crushing victory against a Caledonian host. While the location of this battle is hotly debated, most proposed sites lie in Aberdeenshire, north of the River Dee, with the small mountain of Benihee being a possible candidate. This is significant because it places the battle within what would later become the heartland Pictish political power. It seems likely then that the Picts emerged from among these earlier tribal populations. The Verturiones, first mentioned in the 4th century, are unmistakably Pictish in later sources. Their kingdom, known by its Gaelic name, Fortriu, was based in the northern Pictish zone around modern-day Forres and Inverness. During the early medieval period, kings of the Verturiones appear to have dominated Pictland politically. Historian James Fraser argues that the fading of a broader Caledonian identity, compared with the endurance of Fortriu, highlights the pivotal role this kingdom played in shaping a distinct Pictish identity. However, Fraser casts doubt on the idea of there being exactly 7 Pictish kingdoms. Bede offers his own perspective, dividing Pictland into 2 zones, north and south, separated by the mountainous region known as the Munth. He asserts that by the 730s, the southern boundary of Pictland was at the Firth of Forth, and that the south was dominated by a single consolidated kingdom made up of multiple regions. In contrast, Bede regarded the northern zone as politically fragmented, with 2 or more kingdoms vying for supremacy. It's quite possible that during Bede's lifetime, the southern kingdom below the Munth was politically dominant. The Munth being the old medieval word for the Grampian Mountains. But powerful kings also reigned in the north. In his hagiography of St. Columba, Adomnan recounts Columba's journey up the Great Glen to visit Breda, son of Melkon, a Pictish king whose court lay near modern-day Inverness. Breda ruled from around 554 to 584 AD, and his status is underscored not only by Columba's visit, but also by Bede's description of him as Rex Potentissimus, a most powerful king. It's worth noting that the name of this king appears in several forms across different sources, and you'll hear it pronounced in many different ways. Bride, Breedy, Broody, and in latter Gaelic traditions as Brûde. However, since the Picts didn't speak Gaelic as their primary language, and their own original language is now extinct, the authentic pronunciation has been lost to time. So in this video, Purely for clarity's sake, I've chosen to use RØDE to describe this Pictish king. It's not a definitive reconstruction, just a consistent and accessible choice for the telling of this story. RØDE's kingdom, Fortru, centred in what is now Moray, appears to have been the political heart of Pictland. Another key question is where exactly the Picts lived. Fortunately, we are not entirely reliant on legend to answer this. While it remains unclear whether the Picts were a single political entity or a collection of shifting regional powers, archaeological evidence places their presence firmly across the north and east of Scotland. The myth of Cruithne's 7 sons may be symbolic, but the territories it describes align closely with the distribution of Pictish material remains. One particularly significant site, remote, dramatic, and rich in archaeological insight, lies just half a mile away from the iconic Scottish stronghold of Dunnicaer on the northeast coast of Scotland. One of the most significant breakthroughs in recent Pictish archaeology has been the identification of defended settlements dating from the late Roman Iron Age and into the 5th and 6th centuries AD. Among these, the site of Dunnicaer here stands out as a key discovery. Today it survives only as a crumbling sea stack on the Aberdeenshire coast, just south of Stonehaven. But in antiquity, this promontory was the location of a high-status fortified settlement. The first recorded encounter with Dunnicaer occurred in the 1830s when, as the story goes, a local gravedigger reportedly told a group of boys that there was gold on top of the sea stack. Now, motivated by curiosity or perhaps poverty, they climbed the rock in search of the treasure, but what they found was a different kind of treasure. Instead, they found carved stones, Pictish symbol stones, which they unwittingly threw into the sea. Now, these carvings represent the earliest known discoveries from the site, and indeed among the earliest examples of Pictish symbols ever recorded. It was not until excavations conducted by the University of Aberdeen between 2015 and 2017, under the direction of Professor Gordon Noble, who is kind of like the Indiana Jones of Pictish archaeology, the true significance of Dunnicaer began to emerge. The archaeological work revealed the heavily eroded remains of a promontory fort, defined by a timber-laced rampart and a cluster of internal structures, most of them severely truncated by centuries of coastal erosion. The wall discovered by the boys in the 19th century was, in fact, a surviving fragment of the southern rampart. Finds from the excavation included Roman Samian ware, coarse pottery, glass fragments, and a rare deep blue hemispherical Hofheim cup, possibly a diplomatic gift or the spoils of raiding. The presence of such imports far north of the Roman frontier suggests a well-connected and elite community. Domestic artefacts including spindle whorls, quernstones and metalworking burnishers provide evidence of a sustained occupation. Radiocarbon dating places the site's main period of use firmly within the Roman Iron Age, from the 2nd to the late 4th century AD. The rampart and the carved stones embedded within it date to the 3rd and 4th centuries. But what makes Dunnicaer particularly important is its rarity. Forts are common in the pre-Roman Iron Age, and a number reappear from the 5th and 6th century onwards. But examples from the intervening period are exceedingly scarce. Dunnicaer occupies this very gap, standing as an early and unusual example of a fortified site that predates the widespread appearance of high-status Pictish settlements in the post-Roman era. In this sense, it may represent a prototype for the defended elite strongholds that later defined Pictish political power. The fort's coastal location with bays on either side would have been ideal for maritime activity. During the barbarian conspiracy of 367 AD, Pictish raiding along the Roman frontiers was conducted on a scale that would have required seaborne coordination. Promontory forts like Dunnicaer and others along the east coast of Aberdeenshire, Angus and Fife may have served as staging points for such operations. By the 6th and 7th centuries, maritime power had become a central feature of Pictish rule, with sources noting the presence of a Regulus of Orkney at the court of King Breda. Such accounts suggest a far-reaching naval network extending across northern Scotland and the Isles. And what remains of Dunnicaer today is stark. The stack stands isolated, battered by the North Sea, its summit now a fragment of what once existed. The erosion has been relentless, with large portions of the headland lost to time. Only a narrow section of the original rampart survives, along with the worn bases of structures that hint at domestic occupation. Evidence suggests that the site was abandoned by the late 4th or early 5th century, possibly in response to environmental instability or strategic organisation. Occupation may have then shifted inland to Dunnicaer, which is around 1 kilometre to the south, where fortification continued into the following centuries. Given the meagre settlement remains uncovered in Pict land to date, it's likely that we've significantly underestimated the scale of settlement and indeed the complexity of society that existed in eastern Scotland during the first millennium AD. There is some tantalising evidence pointing towards the centralisation of settlement during this period, but whether this reflects permanent year-round occupation or instead more specialised, perhaps seasonal use, remains to be determined. Over the past few years, new archaeological evidence has come to light indicating far larger concentrations of settlement than previously recognised. At sites such as here at the monumental O Noth in Aberdeenshire, which is the largest Pictish site ever discovered in Scotland. Earlier conventional survey work had suggested that a few hundred house platforms were located within a defined enclosure section of the hill fort. However, LiDAR surveys, which involve laser scanning from an aircraft, along with detailed photogrammetry surveys that stitch together hundreds of drone captured photographs into 3D models, have revealed that the lower fort area may contain significantly more house platforms than previously believed. These surveys indicate there could be at least 800 platforms in total, making O Noth one of the densest known settlement sites in northern Britain. The structures within appear to date primarily to the late Roman Iron Age, roughly between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, though further excavation may yet broaden the chronological range of the site's occupation. If even a small percentage of these platforms were in use at the same time, it would suggest an almost town-like population, a scale of settlement that challenges long-held assumptions about early medieval Scotland. The hill fort of O Noth, with its extensive surrounding settlement remains, looks down upon an elite centre in the valley at RØDE. Was this a major population hub supporting an early royal centre below? Or did O Noth serve a more specific purpose? Or could it have functioned as a seasonal or episodic gathering place? The limited historical references we do have suggest that assembly sites were often used for periodic gatherings, occasions for legal decision making, dispute resolution, and community deliberation. These events could also encompass religious festivals, trading markets, horse racing, communal drinking, gaming, and even ceremonies of royal inauguration. In regard to the language of the Picts, they undoubtedly spoke a distinct tongue separate from that of their neighbours. Bede himself listed it as one of the 5 languages spoken in the British Isles, alongside English, British, Irish and Latin. Moreover, the hagiographical life of St Columba, compassed by Abbot Adovnan of Iona, tells us that Columba needed an interpreter when communicating with the Picts, specifically during his journey along the Great Glen to the court of the Pictish king Breda. At one point during Columba's travels through Pictish lands, a peasant and his entire household were said to have embraced the faith after hearing the word of life, preached through an interpreter. The man, along with his wife, children and servants, was baptized. Broadly speaking, several competing theories exist regarding its classification. Some propose it was a Gaelic tongue, others that it was Brittonic, and a few suggest it belonged to a more ancient pre-Indo-European group. The first 2 views dominate scholarly thought today, with near universal agreement that Pictish was a Celtic language. The primary question is whether it belonged to the P-Celtic or Q-Celtic branch. This distinction stems from the 2 lines of development within the Proto-Celtic language. P-Celtic refers to the Brittonic languages such as Welsh, Cornish and Briton, while Q-Celtic includes the Goidelic or Gaelic tongues like Irish and Scots Gaelic. In modern terms, these linguistic divisions are clearly defined, both by language and geography. However, applying these categories to a much earlier period, before such distinctions had fully formed, proves very difficult. Supporters of the P-Celtic theory point out that the language likely spoken in what became Pictland during the Roman period was a variant of Brittonic. In the 19th century, antiquarian George Chalmers, after studying Pictish king lists, concluded that Pictish and Brittonic were essentially the same. Later, Celtic scholar Whitley Stokes, after examining the Irish annals, argued that Pictish had strong similarities to Welsh. Further weight was added through place name studies in former Pictish regions of Scotland, where William J. Watson found evidence suggesting a dominant P-Celtic linguistic presence. On the other side, as previously discussed, some propose that the Pictish language was Q-Celtic, essentially an early form of Gaelic, perhaps from the ancestor of modern Scots Gaelic. However, Scots Gaelic contains a substantial number of Brittonic loanwords. This suggests that even if Pictish was not P-Celtic, it was heavily influenced by Brittonic. It is precisely this noticeable Brittonic layer that leads historian James Fraser to propose that the language referred to by Bede may have been the dialect spoken by the dominant Verturian elite of Fortru, a Brittonic language partially Gaelicised over time through prolonged contact with Irish and Scottish Gaels. Language by nature is fluid and complex, especially when viewed through the fog of many centuries. It may well be that P-Celtic and Q-Celtic both evolved from a shared Proto-Celtic root within the British Isles, and that, at the time, speakers of each could likely understand one another. It is not difficult to imagine a scenario in which the rising political dominance of the Gallic kingdom of Dalriata from the 8th century onward led to an increasing influence of Q-Celtic features in the Pictish tongue. By the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, formed through the unification of Bernicia and Deira, stood as the dominant political force across the British Isles. Its territory stretched into south-eastern Scotland, reaching as far north as the Firth of Forth. It's highly probable that Northumbrian influence extended even further into the north, with the Picts likely acting as tributaries to Northumbrian kings, well beyond the catastrophic defeat of King Egfrith at the hands of a Pictish ruler, Breda, at the Battle of Dunnicaer in 685 AD. Despite that loss, Northumbria remained a significant political player in southern Scotland for some time afterward. To the west, the Gallic kingdom of Dalriata, spanning the western coastline of Scotland and parts of County Antrim in modern-day Northern Ireland, reached its zenith in the 6th and 7th centuries. Ongoing border clashes with Pictish kingdoms are a consistent theme in the annals of Dalriata's history. Eventually, it appears that the kingdom fell under Pictish domination during the 8th century. This process of consolidation ultimately culminated in the merger of Dalriata and the Pictish kingdom of Fortru, which together would form the medieval kingdom of Alba in the 10th century. Earlier we examined how Pictland was likely composed of multiple smaller kingdoms. There's evidence, for instance, of a kingdom existing in Orkney, one that may have been subordinate to the kings of Fortru, at least during St. Columba's visit to the court of the Pictish leader, Breda. Among these various realms, however, one kingdom features most prominently in the historical record: the kingdom of Fortru. Standing here at Burghead on this dramatic headland jutting into the Moray Firth, we find ourselves at what many scholars now believe was one of the principal power centres of this Pictish kingdom of Fortru. The sheer scale and sophistication of the fort that once crowned this promontory, along with its commanding views over the surrounding coastline, strongly indicate that Burghead played a central role in the military and political apparatus of early medieval Pictland. It's within this wider context that we can begin to understand the emergence of Fortru as the dominant force among the Pictish realms. As we've already discussed, the early medieval territory of Pictland was likely a patchwork of smaller kingdoms. Evidence suggests, for instance, that there was a distinct Pictish kingdom in Orkney, which appears to have fallen under the sway of the kings of Fortru, at least during the time of St. Columba's visit to King Breda, son of Malcolm. But above all others, it's Fortru that dominates the historical record, with its fate often appearing virtually synonymous with that of the Picts themselves. It's no exaggeration either to say that Fortru formed the very nucleus of Pictish political authority throughout the early medieval period. As previously mentioned, the Verturiones, first recorded by the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus in the 4th century, are believed to have been the tribal group who founded Fortru, likely centred here around the Moray Firth. The term Verturiones may derive from a Brittonic root meaning fortress people, which is quite fitting considering sites like here at Burghead. Meanwhile, the 6th century Irish annals, including the Annals of Ulster, use the term Fortren, from which modern historians reconstruct the name Fortru. Etymology aside, the kings of Fortru appear to have achieved significant political control over the majority of what we now consider Pictland during this period. The process of consolidation, unfolding from the 6th century onward and fully realised by the close of the 7th century, is often termed the Verturian hegemony. Though our sources are fragmentary, they consistently portray Fortru as a kingdom of considerable stature. Most revealing is the way its kings are treated by the contemporary chroniclers. In the late 6th century, St. Columba, founder of the monastery at Iona, journeyed to the court of Breda, son of Malcolm, according to Abbot Adovnan's Life of Columba. Breda's capital near River Ness likely corresponded with Fortru's heartland. While not explicitly named King of Fortru, in the text, all geographical indicators suggest that Breda's realm was the precursor to that kingdom. Columba's decision to personally visit Breda's court itself is a testament to the power of the Pictish king's authority over northern Scotland. Particularly fascinating is Adovnan's reference to the presence of the King of Orkney at Breda's court, implying an overlordship that extended beyond the mainland. This suggests that even by the late 6th century, Pictish rulers like Breda were already exercising a broader regional dominion. Further still, Bede's description of Breda as Rex Potentissimus and Irish references to a migration of Gaels fleeing from the son of Malcolm during the 560s hint at a conflict with Dalriata and underscore Breda's active role in forging a dominant political position, one that would evolve into the Verturian Supremacy. By the final decades of the 7th century, that supremacy appears to have solidified. It was Breda, son of Beli, ruling from 671 to 692, who is the first monarch explicitly identified as the king of Fortru. This was a different Breda than the one we have been discussing. This was a later King Breda. Under his leadership, the authority of Fortru extended decisively southwards to the Firth of Forth. His crowning achievement came at the Battle of Dunnicaer in 685 AD, where he dealt a crushing defeat to the Northumbrians. King Egfrith of Northumbria, who was also Breda's cousin, was killed in the encounter, and his army routed, significantly curtailing Northumbrian dominance in Scotland and confining it south of the Forth. It's widely thought that prior to this turning point, the kings of Fortru may have served as subordinate rulers under Northumbrian hegemony. But this decisive victory, likely fought near Loch Inch, marked the emergence of a new independent political order. Even before this, in 681, Breda launched a campaign against Orkney, reinforcing the image of a king intent on consolidating and expanding Fortru's regional supremacy. As historian James Fraser argues, it's quite plausible that it was these very kings, based here in the Moray Firth area, who were instrumental in the formation and promotion of a Pictish identity, distinct and unified under their rule. In 697, Adovnan of Iona convened the Cain Adovnain, a treaty providing legal protection for non-combatants, particularly women and children. This major inter-regional meeting drew participants from across Ireland and Scotland. Notably, the only Pictish king to sign the treaty, aside from the bishop St Curitan, was Breda, son of Derley, king of Fortru. Again, this is another Breda, different to the ones we have been discussing. His signature affirms his role as the principal political authority in Pictland, capable of enforcing laws agreed upon at such high-level diplomatic gatherings. Far from diminishing, Fortru's power persisted well into the 8th century. Kings such as Angus, son of Fergus, would later build on the foundations laid by Breda, expanding Pictish influence even further and asserting dominance across much of what is now Scotland. Although very little of Pictish culture survives, which has perhaps contributed to their mysterious image, archaeology has uncovered a number of Pictish artistic artefacts. The most prominent of these are the monumental stones found across northern and eastern Scotland in historical Pictish areas. Generally dated between the 6th and 9th centuries, these stones display a variety of designs and patterns. Some even feature Ogham inscriptions, and they vary greatly in size and style. Many of the later examples are recognisable as Christian crosses or gravestones, reflecting the Christianisation of the Picts. Theories suggest they may have served as territorial markers, clan symbols, or memorials. Of particular interest are the distinct Pictish symbols carved into many of the earlier stones. These include designs such as the double disc and Z-rod, or the crescent and V-rod, the meanings of which remain entirely unknown. Similarly, the so-called Pictish beast, with its elongated head and peculiar form, appears on both carved stones and Pictish jewellery. It has been compared variously to dolphins, seahorses, elephants, the mythical Kelpie, and even the Loch Ness Monster. Theories surrounding the beast range from a political emblem to a religious symbol, but whatever it represented, it clearly held significant meaning for the Picts, as evidenced by its frequent appearance. Metalwork is the other major category of surviving Pictish art. Silver items in particular make up a substantial portion of these remains. In 1919, a hoard of Roman silver, apparently looted and cut up for redistribution, was discovered at Trappar-in-Law. A still larger hoard was found at Norridslaw in Fife in 1819, which included pieces of Pictish origin. Among the finds was a 7th century silver and enamel plaque bearing the Z-rod motive. Unfortunately, much of the hoard was sold off and melted down by the person who discovered it, leaving us only to guess what remarkable Pictish objects may have been lost. Another example of Pictish silverwork is the large double-linked white clwch chain, also decorated with the Z-rod, one of a group of 10 such chains discovered to date. There is also evidence that the Picts practiced tattooing. Tattooing was apparently widespread among Iron Age cultures in Britain and Northern Europe, although most of the evidence is literary rather than physical, and therefore open to debate. Ancient sources describe various tribes decorating their bodies with patterns and designs, though it remains uncertain whether this refers to tattoos or merely to temporary body paint using dyes like woad. Julius Caesar in the Gallic Wars wrote of the Britons, "All the Britons indeed dye themselves with woad, which gives them a bluish colour and makes them appear more terrible in battle." The Latin term picti, meaning painted, and derived from pingere, to paint, seems to refer to this body decoration. The term appears in the historical record in the year 297 AD in a panegyric speech of praise to Emperor Constantius, which included the line, "A nation which was then primitive and accustomed to fight, still half naked, only with Picts and Hiberni easily succumbed to Roman arms." Despite the dismissive tone regarding their military ability, this is a significant mention. A little over a century later, the poet Claudian, in his Gothic War, described how Roman legions in Britain kept the fierce Scots in check, whose men had scanned the strange devices tattooed on the faces of the dying Picts. While this suggests tattooing, it is still unclear whether Roman writers were describing permanent tattoos or simply body paint applied with woad. Moreover, these descriptions likely refer to peoples who predated the formation of the Pictish kingdoms that arose in the 6th century AD. That said, Isidore of Seville, writing in the 7th century, provides one of the clearest references to Pictish tattooing. In his etymologies, he writes, "Nor should we omit the Picts, whose name is taken from their bodies, because an artisan, with the tiny point of a pin and the juice squeezed from a native plant, decorates them with scars to serve as identifying marks, their nobility being distinguished by tattooed limbs." This would seem to be a fairly direct description of tattooing. However, as historian James Fraser notes, Isidore occasionally confused the Picts with the Scoti, so his account should be treated with some caution. Located at the northeastern tip of the Tarbet Peninsula, Portmahomack emerged as one of the most significant religious sites in all of Pictland. During the early medieval period, it grew into a major religious and monastic centre. Excavations at the site have uncovered remarkable evidence of religious activity, including signs of metalworking and manuscript production, indicators of a sophisticated and industrious monastic life, alongside other religious hubs like St Andrews, Dunkeld, Abernethy and Rosemarkie. This sacred centre of Portmahomack demonstrates the depth of royal and aristocratic investment in the Christian faith among the Picts. When it comes to the religious beliefs of the Picts, particularly before their conversion to Christianity, we are left with very few certainties. The sources are sparse and often filtered through outside observers, but we can still piece together a cautious understanding of their spiritual world. It seems most plausible that the Picts practiced a form of Celtic paganism. Unfortunately, the belief systems of the Celtic peoples were never written down by the Celts themselves, so what little we know comes from external sources, primarily Roman commentators, archaeological evidence, and much later Christian chroniclers. These accounts are far from unbiased, but they suggest a polytheistic religion with a strong emphasis on nature, sacred groves, springs, and other sites of natural significance. Therefore, there was probably a group of religious leaders, similar to the Druids that were described by Roman writers. Given the lack of direct evidence, the most reasonable conclusion is that the Picts, prior to Christianity, likely worshipped in much the same manner as other Celtic-speaking peoples across Britain and Ireland. Interestingly, in a 5th century letter written by St Patrick to a man named Coroticus, he referred to the Picts living south of the Month as apostates, suggesting that they had at one point embraced Christianity before lapsing back into their older pagan practices. As for how the Picts came to convert, the process appears to have been gradual and multifaceted, much like what occurred in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Missionary activity was a key driver. Irish Christianity had a profound influence on the early Pictish church. St Palladius, for example, is said to have settled in Pictland after leaving Ireland, and St Brigid of Kildare is closely associated with the village of Abernethy. Perhaps the most well-known missionary associated with Pictland is St Columba. Writing in the 7th century, the monk Adovnan describes Columba's journey through the Great Glen in the 6th century, all the way to Inverness, where he may have converted King Breda mac Melchon. Adovnan's life of Columba also recounts many incidents of the abbot preaching to ordinary Picts along the way, suggesting that Columba's mission may have had a broader impact on the northern Pictish society. Further south, St Ninian is credited by the Venerable Bede with converting the southern Picts, those living south of the Month. Ninian was traditionally a Briton, and his missionary work, thought to have taken place in the 7th century, is also believed to have been instrumental in spreading the Christian faith throughout southern Pictland. Ninian was traditionally a Briton, and his missionary work, thought to have taken place in the 7th century, is believed to have been instrumental in spreading Christian faith throughout southern Pictish territories. The Irish were not the only external influence. However, the Pictish Church also had strong ties to Northumbria. During the reign of King Nectan, the king made a deliberate decision to align with Roman rather than Irish church practices, specifically the Roman calculation of Easter and the Roman tonsure, which was a visible sign of ecclesiastical conformity. This move appears to have curtailed the influence of Iona's clergy in Pictland and solidified the kingdom's connection to the broader Roman Church. The neighbouring kingdom of Dalriata, with its own Irish Christian roots and its economic and military ties to the Picts, no doubt contributed to the spread of Christianity as well. As with most historical conversions, the process was long and complex. It remains unclear whether it was driven primarily by elite conversion that filtered down to the population, or whether it found broader grassroots appeal. However, the geographical distribution of important religious sites suggests elite involvement. The Viking Age, conventionally said to have begun with the infamous assault on the Northumbrian monastery at Lindisfarne on the 8th of June 793 AD, marked a turning point in the history of the British Isles. Over the course of the 9th century, a growing wave of Norse seafarers made landfall on British shores, originating from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. What began as isolated raids quickly escalated into full-scale invasions, the most significant of which was the arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army in 865 AD. This formidable host laid waste to the once dominant kingdom of Northumbria before pushing south to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon realms of East Anglia and Mercia. Ireland and Scotland were no safe haven either, and the Pictish kingdom found itself squarely in the path of Norse aggression. Initially targeted in coastal attacks, Scotland's territories soon saw increasing concentrations of Viking activity, particularly in Caithness, Sutherland and Galloway. Norse settlers also seized control of the Scottish Isles, and by the middle of the 9th century, it appears the Kingdom of the Isles had taken shape. The Pictish kingdom of Fortru proved unable to effectively resist the advance of Norsemen. In 839 AD, the Picts suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Viking forces. While the precise details of this battle remain obscure, the Irish annals record a devastating entry. The heathens inflicted a defeat on the men of Fortru, and Uan, son of Oenus, and Bran, son of Oenus, and Aed, son of Bunta, and many others, almost beyond number, were slain there. The reference to uncountable casualties strongly implies a large-scale conflict, possibly the culmination of a significant campaign. The sheer loss of manpower would have seriously undermined Pictish military and political strength. Yet perhaps even more catastrophic was the loss of high-ranking leaders, including Uan, king of Fortru, his brother Bran, and Aed, king of Dalriata. Whether Aed fought in person as a subordinate to Uan remains unclear, but the magnitude of the disaster is undeniable. In one devastating blow, the Picts lost 3 major rulers. The death of Uan also brought an end to the House of Fergus, which had held sway over Pictland for the best part of a century. Viking pressure had not yet eradicated Pictish political structures entirely, but they had dealt them a crippling blow. While it might be tempting to regard the Battle of 839 AD as the final stand of the Picts, the reality is more complex. What followed was a period of instability, paving the way for the emergence of the House of Alpin under Kenneth MacAlpin. Though he retained the title King of the Picts, his reign and those of his descendants were marked by an unmistakable process of Gaelicisation. By the start of the 10th century, the realm was increasingly referred to as a different name rather than Pictland, and the Pictish language appears to have undergone a gradual process of Gaelicisation, likely set in motion centuries earlier. The dominant part of Pictland, Fortru, no longer appears in our sources after the early 10th century, after seemingly being divided into the regions of Moray and Ross. This kind of linguistic and cultural transformation is difficult to track in detail, but by the 11th or 12th century, the distinct Pictish identity had been completely subsumed by the dominant Gaelic-speaking Scottish kingdom of Alba.